Hello, a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's programme, scores of lawyers here in France slam the government for refusing to help French citizens who face execution in Iraq. The 11 men are suspected of supporting the Islamic State group. Deafened by the war on the Islamic State group, almost 2 years after gunfire and rockets fall silent on the Iraqi city of Mosul, residents still suffer hearing problems. Also coming up, in Syria, the Aramaic language faces extinction. Today, only 20% of Malula's inhabitants speak the ancient language of Christ. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Middle East Matters. We start with a story that's as polarizing across Europe as it is in the Middle East: the repatriation of terrorists who are foreign nationals. Now, here in France, lawyers have been raising the alarm over the execution of French citizens in Iraq. The 11 men were suspected of being members of the Islamic State group.
This opinion piece, signed by 45 French lawyers, denounces the irregularities of Iraqi courts, in particular the nature of expedited cases which they say don't give the defence fair rights. In particular, they take aim at the French government, saying that their attitude could constitute a huge dishonour for the country.
France argues all over the world that the death penalty should be abolished. Concerning its own foreign nationals, in my opinion, they have a duty to uphold certain core principles. No matter the abominations that these men are accused of, these are principles. Let me remind everyone that France fought very hard against the death penalty concerning its nationals in Indonesia.
These are the two French citizens sentenced to death on Sunday morning, Vianney Ouraghi and Fodil Tahar Aouidat. In total, 11 French jihadists have been condemned to death this past week, all of them sentenced by this Iraqi anti-terrorist court in Baghdad for being part of the Islamic State group.
Iraq, in the name of countries all over the world, are hunting these criminals. It is part of our fight against ISIS.
France has ruled out the repatriation of these jihadists, saying they prefer them to be tried in Iraq, but at the same time have said that they disagree with the death penalty on principle.
If some of our foreign nationals are sentenced to death, then we will ask for life imprisonment or an equivalent sentence instead, one that is recognized in accordance to our bilateral agreements.
More jihadists could be convicted in the near future. 450 French nationals linked to ISIS are currently being held in Syria.
Now, it's been almost 2 years since Iraqi forces recaptured Mosul from the claws of the Islamic State group. As the residents of the city struggle to move on, they're contending with a disability. Thousands still suffer hearing problems, which often go untreated. Catherine Clifford has the story.
In this crowded corridor, residents, young and old, wait for long-delayed tests to determine the extent of the damage to their ears. 2 years after their city was liberated and the planes and guns fell silent. There are just a few of some 2,000 Mosul residents to visit this hearing impairment centre, recently opened with funding from an Iraqi humanitarian organisation. Dr. Mohammed Saeed believes there are thousands more cases yet to be diagnosed.
We call this acoustic trauma. We've distributed hearing aids as required to each patient. There are cases of severe hearing loss that we refer to hospitals in Baghdad because these patients need a cochlear implant, especially children between 2 and 6 years old.
Blasts in conflict zones can send tiny pieces of debris into the human ear and rupture the eardrum, which transmits sound further into the cochlea. Nerves in the cochlea, which send sound onto the brain, can also be destroyed by explosions. Mines have noise levels of around 170 decibels. That's double the level needed to cause permanent damage to the ears. Salam Ahmed's son almost entirely lost his hearing after a bomb struck the street behind the family home, sending a deafening rain of rubble onto their roof.
His ear started bleeding and he was in pain, so we took him to get treatment. And the specialist said that he suffered from a ruptured eardrum because of the bombing, high levels of noise, and warplanes. We have to shout or use sign language when we want to talk to him, because he doesn't hear us.
Mosul's health infrastructure was ravaged during Islamic State rule and the battle to take back the city. 6,000 hospital beds available before the siege were reduced to just 1,000. Now, with help from outside charities, hospitals are slowly reopening.
Moving on to the mountain village of Ma'lula, one of the world's oldest Christian settlements where Aramaic was once widely used. Today, however, the ancient biblical language is starting to disappear. According to experts, it was the outbreak of the Syrian civil conflict in 2011 that changed everything.
This ornate script is the biblical language of Jesus. George Sa'arur is one of the last in Syria to specialize in ancient Aramaic. At his small shop in Ma'lula, north of Damascus, he has collected over the years encyclopedias and books on the language. Aramaic has been heard in the streets of Ma'lula for 2,000 years, but the war has left the city deserted of inhabitants.
80% of the inhabitants of Ma'lula don't speak Aramaic, and the remaining 20% are over 60 years old. So this is a dangerous period. The Aramaic language is in danger of extinction.
Rebels and jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda seized Ma'lula at the end of 2013, forcing most of its Christian inhabitants to flee. Today, only a third have returned. The churches have been restored, but the religious songs resound more and more in the void.
The language may disappear because we can only rely on a handful of people who sing in Aramaic in our churches in Ma'lula, and those who write and compose the songs, stories and poetry.
Ma'lula was a point of passage for tourists who came to admire the monasteries, but the majority of the houses are now empty. In the only kindergarten of the village, the number of students has fallen by over 2/3 since 2010.
Before, there was no Aramaic at school. Absolutely not. They spoke at home. It was inherited from generation to generation. Children that did not speak the language at home did not learn it. But these children were born outside Ma'lula during the years of exile, so they may have learned Arabic first.
Today, these children attend a daily Aramaic class, a slim hope to save the language of the Bible.
We finish with another episode of our weekly animation series, Flavors of Iraq. This week, our protagonist, Farhat, gets permission to be embedded with the US military in his home country, that's Iraq. He describes what he witnessed from the sidelines, which challenged his ability to remain impartial as a journalist.
Baghdad, 2008. After 5 years in the red zone reserved for Iraqis, I went to the green zone for the first time, where the Americans and their allies lived under high security. As a journalist, I obtained permission to film the US Army on duty. I felt like I was in a movie. We took off from a base near Baghdad. On the runway where we landed, dozens of white spots. They were Iraqi prisoners on their way to either Abu Ghraib or Camp Bucca, the country's 2 big prisons used by the Americans. While Abu Ghraib was known for the 2004 torture scandal, Camp Bucca was known for incubating what later became ISIS. It's where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi built the foundations of his Islamist group. Thousands of Iraqis were locked up there, sometimes for no reason, stopped randomly by the Americans in the heat of the battle. I thought of my cousin Ahmed. He went through both prisons because he belonged to a group of anti-US insurgents. I could imagine his joy surrounded by thousands of detainees when he found out he was going to be a father. And I could also see him getting killed by al-Qaeda jihadists in Iraq just after leaving prison. I could picture Ahmed in front of me, humiliated, frightened, slowly approaching his fate. It was hard to stay in my position as a journalist. Had I been born in Fallujah, I might have found myself among these men.
That's all for us this week. If you want to reach out to us, we're on Twitter and Facebook. That's France24 Middle East Matters. You can also watch our previous episodes on our website. That's www.france24.com. Thank you for being with us.